All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Card Not Present Fraud and the Role of 3D Secure, the Tale of Different Countries. Before I introduce our presenters, here are a few housekeeping notes. So during the webinar, you'll be able to ask questions by typing those into the chat. The chat is indicated on the question mark on the right. We'll do our best to answer all the questions at the end of the presentation. And if we're unable to answer them during the webinar, we'll follow up with you directly. After the webinar, you'll receive an email with a link to the recorded webinar and the new Datos Insights report. So I'm happy to introduce our two speakers, Julie Conroy and Scott Olson. Julie is the Chief Insights Officer at Datos Insights, a global research and advisory firm. Prior to Datos, Julie spent several years leading product management at Early Warning Services. And prior to that, she was in product and process management roles at a large credit issuer, as well as an ACH, wire, and SWIFT processor. Julie is fluent in Spanish and holds a master's degree from the Monterey Institute of International Studies and a bachelor's degree from Michigan State University Honors College. Scott Olson is our Chief Marketing Officer at Outseer. He's a leader in marketing strategy with over 25 years experience and specializes in security and fraud management technology. Prior to Outseer, Scott led marketing and product teams at multiple businesses, including TransUnion and iovation. Scott holds degrees from Duke University and the University of Texas at Austin. So welcome, both of you. We'll begin with you, Julie.
Great, thanks very much. And Connie, if you could share the slides, that would be awesome. So yeah, looking forward to this discussion. CNP fraud is a question that comes up quite frequently from our clients, both on the issuer side, the processor side, the merchant side of the house. It's one of those forms of fraud that continues to grow rapidly across the ecosystem, particularly in those countries that don't have regulation around CNP fraud that requires things like strong customer authentication. And as I talk to our clients about how they're designing their control frameworks, the goal is really to design them in such a way to avoid this customer experience. And I think we probably have all had it, where you just get very frustrated by the inability to complete the transaction that you want to complete. And so I think this is a baseline goal. Let's avoid this. At the same time that we see the rising tide of fraud attacks on CNP, we also just continue to see that e-commerce continues to grow globally as a percentage of total retail card sales. We certainly saw kind of that bump with the pandemic that you can see across all geos as we went into the forced lockdown in most countries. Some of those forced consumer behaviors to online did retrench after the pandemic, but in many cases, consumers realized that curbside shopping is really convenient, and they maintained these new digital first behavior patterns. And as a result, we continue to see e-commerce growing rapidly across the globe. There are some markets like Latin America where it's still growing at a 30% year-over-year clip. That's great for commerce. It's also great for fraudsters, and they are very much taking advantage of this. We recently completed a survey, and this is actually one of the first groups that gets to see this data. We're not going to be actually publishing it till first quarter, but we recently surveyed merchants across both the US and the UK to understand, as you've been looking at the attack vectors over the last couple of years, what has that done to your decline rates? And as you can see here across both geos, more than 2/3 of the surveyed merchants have seen their fraud declines increase over the past couple of years. And a significant percentage of them have seen those declines increase by 5% or more, which means, in some cases it is fraudsters, but in some cases you're creating customer insults and you're losing good consumers to false declines. As you look at kind of what that false decline equation looks like, the weighted average in the US right now for the CNP card not present authorization rate hovers right around 89% based on the merchant feedback in this survey. And as you look at card present transaction authorization rates, those are consistently over 98%. So, some of that delta, that 9% delta, is going to be fraud that is rightfully getting declined, but there's also going to be a lot of false declines in that number. And I think, the UK is a good indicator of just how much of that 9% delta is false declines, because as we conducted this study and spoke to many UK and German issuers for it, the authorization rates for CNP were hovering right around 94 to 95%. So that indicates that, where you do have markets where you have equitable participation in strong customer authentication, and you have merchants sending the vast majority of their traffic through strong customer authentication rails, and then those rails then inform the authorization process as well, you can see that a lot more of those transactions will get across that card not present finish line. And the study that we just completed that Connie referenced at the outset does show that 3D Secure usage is still highly variable depending on the geography. And the dependency really is, are there regulatory or network mandates that require that if you have CNP, that some percentage of them have to have strong customer authentication invoked. So as you look at the European market, well over 70% of the transactions are going across strong customer authentication, generally 3D Secure rails specifically. In Australia, around 50% today of the transactions are using 3D Secure. That will increase in the next year or so. There is a mandate currently that will increase there's a mandate pending that will increase the volume of transactions that will be required to invoke 3D Secure in Australia. Conversely, as you look at the North American market, in the US right now, we're seeing right around 3% of transactions are going across 3D Secure rails, and that really hasn't changed much since we did a similar study to this one 2 years ago. And we'll be doing a few more comparatives that look at what's changed and what's remained the same in the 2 years between these two studies. One thing we are seeing for sure is that merchant engagement with 3D Secure is growing rapidly. So as you look at this data that Outsier kindly provided, as you look at the unique merchant ID growth from the first half of 2022 to the first half of 2023, you can see significant uptick in just the quantity of merchants that are now invoking 3D Secure. Asia Pac, it's up over 53%. In the US and Canada, it's up 42%. Up 41% for the UK. I think the reason why EMEA numbers are relatively low compared to the other regions is just for the bulk of continental Europe, the strong customer authentication mandate began prior to first half of 2022. So you already had a large number of merchants that were already invoking 3D Secure. In some geos, these are going to be net new merchants that are using them domestically for a variety of reasons, either regulatory mandate or because they do want to have the benefit of that liability shift and the potential for higher authorization rates. In other cases, e-commerce is a global ecosystem. And so if you are a merchant that is sitting in Canada, but you want to do business with any consumer in the European Union, you have to have 3D Secure enabled so that you can compliantly transact with those consumers. We do see that, as you look at kind of the study that we just completed this year, where we interviewed issuers across 5 different geos, across the US, Canada, UK, Germany, and Australia. We do see that there is increased satisfaction with the performance of 3D Secure, and it's substantially increased compared to what the study that we did in 2021. And I do think that this is because we are seeing that there's 2 years more experience on both the issuer and the merchant side with 3DS2. And so with that increased experience, as merchants are sending cleaner data, which is creating more beneficial outcomes, that is creating better experiences for both the issuers and the merchants alike. And also, as we'll see in a few slides, one of the potentials of 3DS2 that everybody was looking forward to when it was first introduced was the ability to then translate those authentication outcomes using the many enhanced data fields that came with 3DS2 versus 3DS1, and using those to help to create better authorization outcomes by feeding those results to the authorization system. We also see, as you look comparatively at the results from the 2021 survey versus the 2023 survey, as we asked issuers about whether 3D Secure was better than the rest of their control framework for CNP, about the same or not as good. Another substantial change between these two studies was we did see that a big jump in perception of the efficacy of 3D Secure in the North American market specifically. And as we kind of delved into some of the reasons for that during our conversations with these issuers, it was a number of things. It was upgrading authenticators so that you had more secure authenticators that weren't as susceptible to fraudsters. So things like moving from SMS or email OTP to something like mobile app push or biometric. Another cause for the kind of the uptick in sentiment around 3DS was just more refined data analytics in the risk-based authentication that was creating better outcomes. And another key reason that was cited as we were looking into this was just the issuers did like having the option of introducing stepped-up authentication in the event that there was some borderline risk cases versus just having that binary of either yes or no, approve or decline. And so those were all cited as reasons for this kind of substantial uptick in satisfaction year over year. As you look at the markets where there has been some form of strong customer authentication versus those that have not, I think one of the indicators of the performance and the potential of 3D Secure is just looking at the outcomes from a fraud loss perspective. So this chart with the dark blue, that shows card not present fraud losses in the UK from 2018 through 2022. The lighter blue column are the fraud losses for CNP in Australia for those same years. And as you can see with the UK market, where preparations for the strong customer authentication mandate were underway for quite a while, we did see that consistently year over year, those card not present fraud losses were coming down, even at the same time that card not present transaction volumes were growing 9% year over the same time period. Australia was a little bit more bumpy in terms of the fraud losses, and that's really because the mandate for those years in Australia, starting in 2019, was much less in terms of the volume of CNP transactions that were required to invoke strong customer authentication. It was a swath of MCC codes, but it was by no means the entire CNP ecosystem. Again, that's poised to change with the pending mandate that OSPay currently has going through the system. But even so, if you look in aggregate, the increase in Australia in fraud losses over that time period was much less than the aggregate increase of 8% year over year in card not present fraud during that period. By contrast, if you look at non-regulated markets, such as the US, both CNP fraud losses as well as false declines continue to be quite problematic for merchants and issuers alike. We have seen a steady and consistent growth in those fraud losses, for the past few years, really quite consistent with the pace of e-commerce growth in the US market as a whole. As you look at our projections, we actually do start projecting a bit of an uptick in the pace of CNP fraud growth relative to the pace of aggregate CNP, because I think we're already starting to see it in this market. It's very similar to when North America was not on chip cards and most of the rest of the globe had already migrated to chip. And we saw a sharp acceleration in counterfeit card fraud in North America as fraudsters realized that those markets that aren't on the stronger fraud controls really represent kind of the soft underbelly and the easier opportunity. And I think we're already starting to see that uptick in intensity of attacks in the North American market as a result. As we talk to issuers and merchants about some of the key attack vectors they're seeing, enumeration attacks are once again a big issue, which it's a little crazy to me that it's 2023 and we're still facing enumeration attacks. But the automation that the fraudsters are bringing to bear are creating some very effective attack vectors on that front. Good old-fashioned credential stuffing, still very effective. We're seeing a major uptick in loyalty, refund, and promo abuse. This isn't necessarily something that 3D Secure would be able to address, but it just highlights the extent to which we're up against very organized and very creative fraud rings that will, again, it's like water seeping to the path of least resistance. They find their opportunities to get the funds. And then there's also first-party fraud. And this is another place where something like 3D Secure and strong customer authentication can be effective. That's just in finding and weeding out your first-party fraudsters. Now, there was one issuer I spoke with that had done some forensic analysis on a few different MCC codes where they were seeing fully authenticated 3D Secure fraud. One of them specifically was crypto. And by going into the forensics, actually listening to contact center recordings, they determined that around 70% of their fully authenticated 3D Secure fraud, what specific to crypto, was first party, and it was buyer's remorse. And that in and of itself is another great tool to help manage your customer base. And if you have repeat offenders, potentially see them to the door to do business elsewhere. And as we talk to the merchants and the issuers in the ecosystem, the increasing fraud loss in this market is concerning. And the false declines are often even more concerning because that is creating a bad customer experience. It's losing revenue. It risks losing customers as your card goes to back of wallet or that consumer chooses to go to a different e-commerce site. So all of these are challenges that the ecosystem is struggling with from a CNP perspective. And the good news is that there are an increasing number of tools at issuers' disposal. And so as we conducted these interviews and asked about what the control framework looks like for CNP for them today, typically the baseline and the first line of defense is going to be your analytical models from both an authorization and a fraud perspective. 3D Secure was instrumental and listed by every single issuer that we interviewed as part of that CNP control framework. We are seeing that tokenization is also increasingly playing a role, although as we asked about kind of the levels of volume that is actually invoking tokenization, for the vast majority of issuers, it was still pretty minimal. And then on the back end, you have your variant authentication mechanisms. And we'll go into a little bit more detail about how these are evolving in a couple more slides here. As you look at kind of the invocation of stepped up authentication, abandonment rates have always been one of the key concerns. And we still see that globally we've got room for improvement on abandonment rates. 70% of the issuers that we surveyed are seeing 11% or more transactions abandoned when stepped-up authentication is invoked. Now, again, part of that abandonment will be 3D Secure doing its job, and it's fraudsters that are abandoning because they can't navigate the step-up. We also saw, as we compared regulated versus non-regulated customer markets, attrition rates do tend to be lower in those regulated markets where consumers have really become trained to expect stepped-up authentication. And there were a couple of issuers that we spoke with that said they've become so well trained that if you do start bringing the frictionless experience back, in some cases the consumers become concerned because they don't feel as protected in those environments. And also when consumers have the ability provided by their issuer to choose their authenticator, we also see a lower propensity to attrite. And this really is driven by the fact that we have bodies of consumer survey research that we at Datos have done over the years that show that there are some strong preferences for preferred authenticators. And if you slice that data by age demographic, you see some patterns that emerge, such as your seniors and your older boomers generally don't like the fingerprint biometric nearly as much as your younger demographics. And that's because as we all get older, our fingerprints start to wear off and it doesn't work as well for us. So providing that ability to have the consumer engage in authentication in their preferred method also creates more favorable outcomes. We do see that an increasing number of issuers are feeding 3DS outcomes to their authorization systems. The percentage of issuers that are doing that today, and that's that dark blue line on the left here, was a significant uptick versus the study that we did back in 2021, which was great news. And we do see that a few of those that are not also have it on the 1 to 2 year roadmap. There's still folks that have not been able to prioritize it for that 1 to 2 year roadmap yet. But again, as you look at some of the stats that we presented, that we talked about earlier, just in terms of the outcomes, and we actually have some concrete stats coming up, it does create much more beneficial outcomes if you can feed that knowledge of a successful authentication event into that authorization system. And once again, our regulated markets are our poster children here, where you've got 90 to 96% authorization rates using 3D Secure. And this stat specifically comes out of the UK market. With those transactions that ride the 3D Secure rails there, they're averaging around a basis point of fraud, which creates, all of that creates better CX, it creates higher interchange revenues. Conversely, if you look at the transactions in the UK market that do not ride the 3D Secure rails, issuers are averaging a 70 to 75% authorization rate and around a 13 basis point fraud rate. So I think that comparison provides a pretty stark example of how performance in markets that have equitable use of strong customer authentication can improve their outcomes. We do see that many issuers are seeking to upgrade their authentication mechanisms. And actually, this was a really welcome bit of news versus the 2021 study that we did for me. Just because in 2021, as you can see here, only 8% of those issuers that we surveyed had plans to upgrade in the next couple of years, versus today it's 44%, and another 50% said maybe. And I think it's just a broad recognition that there are weak authenticators out there, that fraudsters are having a pretty easy time to compromise. Email OTP, I would put at the top of the list as one of the absolute weakest. But we also had a lot of conversations with issuers about SMS OTP also being vulnerable to compromise, both through SIM swapping, but also a ton of social engineering of the SMS OTP. Mobile app push definitely one of the most secure, although that also is susceptible to the social engineering. So as we talk to issuers about what they plan to be upgrading or adding to that authentication control framework for strong customer authentication, the most common that were on the roadmap were physical biometrics, behavioral biometrics, and that mobile app push. And then coming soon, we do have FIDO in introducing in the 2.4 version of 3D Secure. And that device resident biometric capability should make it even easier and more seamless for consumers to engage with those physical biometric authenticators. So as we look at kind of the evolution on the regulation front, which obviously, the title of this webinar was the tale of different countries, and the regulation really is what drives that differentiated tale. In the European Union, we first saw the requirement for strong customer authentication come with PSD2. We now have the framework for PSD3 that was announced in June of this year. The specifics are not yet fully formed, especially since there's going to be some country by country responsibility for implementation. But generally speaking, as you look at timelines, we expect to have a much more fully formed picture of what this will look like by the end of next year, and then implementation probably early 2026 or so. The framework that was set forth in June, specific to strong customer authentication evolution, specifically for CNP, is we will see an increased data sharing in those enhanced data fields by merchants as a requirement. You will see a liability shift for fraud going to digital wallets and payment gateways if they fail to apply strong customer authentication. There will be issuer liability for bank spoofing fraud, which I think that's going to be a big one. There was a change to the two-factor authentication application, which early days I don't love. We'll see how it manifests in reality. But right now you do have to have, as you pick your two factors, you have to have one from either knowledge, possession, or inherence, and you have to have one from at least two of those buckets. With the change that's proposed, you could do two factors from the same bucket. So it could be two factors of authentication from inherence, for example. Devil will be in the details for that one in terms of just not creating loopholes that fraudsters can get through. Another piece of it is that mail order, telephone order will be exempt. So that'll be beneficial from a travel perspective, just so long as they have secure controls around it. And subscriptions will only require first-time authentication. And also to enable this to have a equitable application to certain populations, authentication must include form factors beyond the smartphone. And specifically cited in some of the guidance was, there are older populations or less financially advantaged populations that don't have a smartphone. So authentication must be able to be applicable to those populations. The other thing on the regulatory front is that we do see that a number of countries have been watching what Europe has been doing with strong customer authentication for the last few years. And Australia, I already mentioned, Mexico, Turkey, Japan, there's a few others that are all in various stages of evaluating their own strong customer authentication mandate. And I think there will probably be many more dominoes that will fall on this front. So as we look at just kind of some of the key takeaways from the study that we performed, I think that good data hygiene for both issuers and merchants is something that is key to the effectiveness of both the fraud prevention ecosystem as well as the effective application of 3D Secure. And I think that is clear as you look at some of the changing sentiment over the past 2 years around 3D Secure and the enhanced data fields. 3D Secure works well in those markets that have equitable participation among merchants and issuers, those markets that don't allow merchants to cherry pick and kind of send the worst of the worst across 3D Secure rails, hoping to see what sticks. And a number of other geographies have recognized this and appear poised to follow the EU's lead. And it's great to see that we continue to progress the authenticators that we're associating, because the fraudsters don't stand still, and we need to just continue to be vigilant as they find ways to get around SMS OTP and upgrade to the next best authenticator that makes it much more difficult for them. So with that, I will turn it over to Scott, who can talk about some of the observations that Outseer is seeing and some of the ways they can help.
Great, thank you, Julie. That was fantastic. And from an Outseer perspective, I mean, this is research that we're just really engaged in and seeing the impact of 3D Secure for issuers and the positive benefits in terms of both reducing fraud as well as increasing authorizations. And so appreciate the time that Datos did working with us on these surveys, especially to get a global perspective on all of these results. And so, as Julie mentioned, I'm going to give a little bit from the Outseer perspective on 3D Secure. And I'm going to kind of start from a perspective of that the results that we saw were that 3D Secure is definitely having an impact. I mean, I think these results bear out, especially on those regulated markets that Julie mentioned, like the EU. 3D Secure is reducing fraud, but also increasing positive transactions. So it's doing a great job. But there's a common misconception with a lot of people that we talk to is that because 3D Secure is a common standard, that the variance between solutions out there is not that great. And that's actually not the case. I mean, not all 3D Secure ACS solutions are alike. And in fact, in our work with a lot of our clients and prospects, based on the solutions they choose and the configurations they have in place, if they don't take deliberate care with their solutions, they can unnecessarily challenge customers. They can they don't trust their risk engine because it's not accurate enough, or they're maybe not paying enough attention, or it's too complicated in terms of tuning and case marking the outcomes of their solutions. And as a result, they're missing a lot of the benefits from 3D Secure. So many companies perceive this as a difficult choice that they're facing, is that, balancing the number of challenges that they put in front of customers with reducing fraud. And so, if you challenge more and you challenge unnecessarily, then you can have lost customers and revenue. The experience can be poor if it's too many unnecessary challenges. Or they can challenge less and deal with more fraud. And so, from the perspective of that balance between optimizing the customer experience, the solution matters. The accuracy of the risk score really, really matters. And it can drive a lot of different kinds of costs, both fraud costs, operational costs in the call center, and of course the costs from actual fraud rates that they see. I'm going to walk through here some actual examples of clients that we work with that did a value analysis on the Outseer 3DS solution compared to alternatives that they had experience with. And the actual results are astounding. If you take a look at what a well-implemented, effective solution can be, it can be tens of millions of dollars or more per year in terms of savings to your bottom line. And if you take a look at the specific areas of metrics that you ought to be taking a look at in your own systems, it's really in these main high-level areas, which is, what is your fraud detection rate? What are your fraud rates? Are you declining that on a regular basis? And relative to your intervention rates, it's kind of that balance of how much do you have to challenge to catch how much fraud. The other part of this is your transactions approval rate. Of course, when you think about declines, you want to make sure you're declining all of the fraud. So what is your false decline rate is really a key metric that you have there. coupled with your approval rates. And I think some of what Julie pointed to was that balance and variance that we see in regulated and unregulated markets, where the transaction approval rate is actually significantly higher in those regulated markets where 3D Secure is used consistently. And then finally, you want to look at your overall operational costs. If the effectiveness of your 3D Secure strong customer authentication, if it's not optimized, you can direct too many people to your contact center. If they have a failed challenge, if their experience is not strong, as well as your case investigations, you want to make sure that you have a very streamlined process for managing the operational flow. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at just 2 quick slides of an example that I mentioned, which is the value analysis we did with one of our customers. Now, this customer is a very large customer. They're processing over 500 million transactions annually. But we looked at 4 key areas. We looked at their fraud detection rate. We looked at the average decline rate. We looked at the challenge rate and their success rate on 3DS transactions. As you can see, they had significant improvements from Althea relative to to that other vendor that they were analyzing. And you may look at that and think about 1 percentage point is not significant, but when you look at that in the context of overall volume, it made a massive difference in the overall return of investment and an impact to the bottom line. In fact, for this issuer, when you add up the differences between these key metrics and the performance evaluation that we did, it was over $53 million delta with the Althea solution relative to the other one that they did that value analysis on. So this is something that we actually work deeply with our customers about. And in fact, we have an ROI calculator on our website that we're going to have the link within the webinar that you can go on yourself. And you can actually play around with some of the numbers and see what basis points of changes in your authorization rates, your challenge rates, your fraud detection rates can mean in terms of your overall savings of your programs with 3D Secure. This is something we encourage our customers to do. You can do it yourself, but we also have fraud analysts that can, and experts that can work with you and just walk through some of the details of how these changes can actually be realized within your own business. And so that's something that we like to focus in on, is that the quality of that 3D Secure ACS solution matters. 3D Secure is a powerful weapon against card-not-present fraud, but also in streamlining the experience that we have with customers. As Julie mentioned, increasingly the outcomes of 3D Secure evaluations are being fed into authorization systems as well. And so this is overall improving the accuracy of the engagements that we have with consumers online for e-commerce. And so with that, I'm going to keep the Althea portion of this pretty short. We do have some questions that have come through. If you have a question that you haven't input already, I would encourage you to go ahead and add it here. But as a final thing, in terms of resources that are available, first of all, we have the report that Julie is referencing a lot of the data from available for download. So this Datos Insights report is just fantastic. We love working with Datos, and so this report will be available for download. I encourage everybody to do that. We have a previous webinar that goes in more details on some of the slides that I just walked through in terms of that ROI analysis and looking at what the impacts of differences in your ACS provider can mean. And then we have the ROI calculator. You can try that yourself and set up a consultation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Connie to kind of highlight some of the questions that have come through, mostly for Julie.
Great. Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Julie, for that presentation. That was very good. Yeah, we do have some questions. So the first is from Keith at ABSA. Does this mean that the US will take even longer to implement 3SD2?
So I'll take it first, and Scott, feel free to chime in on anything I missed. I mean, short answer, fully implement? Yes, it definitely does. There is a requirement both on the issuer and the merchant side that all of the instances of 3DS must be 3DS 2 dot something. 3DS 1 has been fully deprecated at this point. But in terms of just the the percentage of aggregate CNP transactions that goes across 3DS rails in the US, I do think it will take a mandate of some sort to get us to the volumes that you see in markets like Australia or Europe. And thus far, it does look like a mandate in the US market is probably not in the near term.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and maybe what I would just add to that is that the mandate is probably not likely coming. I thought one of the most interesting outcomes from this report was the changing attitude in North American FIs in terms of their perception of 3DS relative to other fraud controls. It was almost a 3 times increase in their positive perceptions of 3D Secure in terms of outperforming their existing fraud controls. And so I think that collaboration between merchants and issuers is going to be something that is explored. But like Julie says, I don't believe that there's any pending legislation that's going to move to that SCA requirement in the US or in North America.
I will say that in a few of the conversations we had in North America, the issuers actually said, we wish there would be a mandate, which you don't hear banks asking for regulation and mandates that often. But they were saying, it was a very consistent conversation I had across a number of these issuers, was that we've made the investment in the infrastructure. We can see that where we do have some merchants that send 100% of their volume, it works pretty well. And we wish that there'd be a mandate so that the merchants weren't sending the worst of their worst across 3D Secure rails, which then in turn forces us to be a bit more draconian as well.
Great, thank you. All right, the next question is, what are the SCA minimum controls applied in the mentioned regions?
So it's going to vary a little bit region by region, just specifically how the regulation works. For example, in the European market, you've got kind of a blanket requirement, but then there's a whole bunch of exemptions, somewhat complex exemptions, and that's why you don't see 100% of volume in the European market. It's more on average around 70. The pending OSPay mandate, if it goes through as proposed right now, it's much more complex. But the exemptions and the complexity of what qualifies and what doesn't aside, I think kind of your general principles are that you must have risk-based authentication that bring in some of the indicators of inherence, such as device or behavioral. And then for your higher risk transactions, you must also have strong customer authentication. And I would say that the one commonality I see across places like India and Europe and Australia is you must have 2 factors of authentication for all transactions. Doesn't have to be necessarily inserting friction for all transactions as long as you have 2 factors of authentication.
Thank you. So the next one says, not a question, a comment. In the age of bin enumeration attacks, decline rate is a meaningless data point. We want to decline 100% of fraud attempts. The percentage of that total represents is out of our hands. It's determined by the fraudsters. Do you have any comments on that?
No, he's spot on. And enumeration is something that you've got to be able to spot it to decline all 100%. And so once you've spotted it, and I know that at the network level, they're blocking a good chunk of these as well, but there's still a ton that's getting through. And so once you figure out that it's an enumeration attack, you want to block all of those coming through.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that also gets to that question in terms of the accuracy of your risk models as well. It's that you do care about false declines, though. And so those are the things where certainly true positives, you wanted to block all true fraud, right? I mean, you want to be able to identify and block that and have those outcomes. And what you want to minimize are any kind of false declines that are out there. And those are the things that are really zeroing in terms of the effectiveness of the solutions. And 3D Secure is in the absence of 3D Secure, a lot of times you have a higher rate of false declines because they don't have that assurance in terms of that step up, that next step. And I think, Julie, you kind of alluded to that a little bit in your presentation, is when all you have is the risk score and you don't have that additional step up assurance, sometimes you have to block at a higher rate. And that's where you see non-3DS protected transactions actually having a higher rate of false declines in general.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Next question is, what future developments or strategies do you foresee in the realm of CNP fraud prevention, especially regarding the role and evolution of 3DS?
Wow, that's a big question. I alluded to FIDO as part of the discussion, and I do think that that's going to be an important step forward. And actually, it was an interesting bit of dichotomy in the interviews that we did. Yeah, we asked all of the issuers about just their awareness of FIDO coming into 2.4, their plans to evolve their controls to take advantage of this. In non-regulated markets, there was very low awareness that this was even coming down the pike. In regulated markets, especially the UK, the issuers were really excited about this coming, and we're seeing this as a nice evolution to once again just make that strong customer authentication process a bit more seamless for the consumer, a bit more user-friendly. So I think that is one important piece. I do actually like a lot what I'm seeing with PSD3 and seeing that enhanced data become a requirement. Once again, I think, as you look at how this is implemented, we just need to make sure that as it becomes a requirement, there's also mechanisms to ensure it's good data coming in, because the data will only inform the outcomes to the extent that it's clean data and not dirty data. And then I think just continuing to apply more advanced analytics to all of this data on both sides of the equation and facilitate a little bit more of that collaboration that was the vision of 3DS2. I think all of that will create improved outcomes. Scott, I'm sure you've got some thoughts there too.
No, yeah, I think that is you hit the nail on the head. I think in terms of kind of the key changes that are coming. I think that for us, it's just in terms of the implementation of these changes across the globe in terms of what is the adoption by merchants, because they're driving a lot of the volume and transactions. To me, it's more of an attitude and perceptions, and what I'm looking for is that interactions between the merchants and issuers, and in terms of how do they work together to combat CNP fraud. From our perspective, I think one of the key elements of this is using consortium data and using outcomes and tracking and to fight fraud. But overall, I think that what I loved about this report is just showing the power of 3DS when it's embraced, and especially in regulated markets. I think that it is proven to be highly effective. That implementing stronger customer authentication is actually extremely effective. When customers get used to that process, it's very well received, it's understood, and it's something that is not a burden or a friction as they get used to it. In fact, they feel more protected sometimes when they see it. So, overall, I think this has been great working with Datos on this research. It's the second time we've done a study on 3D Secure. We intend to do more research going forward. We always love working with Julie and with Datos. And I would encourage everybody to download that report. It's got a lot more than what we just went through. Again, I appreciate everybody's attention on here. If you didn't get your question answered, we can absolutely follow up with that. Oh, actually, maybe just one last question. I saw one that just came in from Bias around, does tokenization lower the risk of CNP transaction data compromise?
Transaction data compromise. So I was on board with that question, so we got the compromise piece in there. I think so. I'm going to answer it in two different ways. I think if you're thinking about data compromise is in terms of data breaches, it definitely can help for sure, because you don't necessarily have that pan in the clear available. So it's your data, if somebody's breached, has effectively been devalued. That's one of the key concepts behind tokenization. Tokenization can also help with just fraud prevention. But there it's a much more complex ecosystem. And that's where, as you look at some of the newer tokenization changes that have been introduced by the networks, we're just not yet seeing a lot of uptake in terms of actual transaction volume, because you've got to get both the merchants and the issuers and the processors all on board using this, some of these frameworks. And that's been very slow going thus far.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you very much. And thanks to everybody's time on this webinar. It will be recorded. So if you had colleagues that weren't able to attend, we'll be able to share the link through email, and this will be available for anybody that wants to share this with some of their coworkers, or if you want to go back and replay any of the specific comments or sections. So again, thank you very much to Julie and Dados, and thanks for everybody's attention here. Have a great rest of the week.
Thank you.